Welcome to the Foothills, a Colorado lifestyle and real estate podcast featuring mountain home real estate broker Robert Martin, who has over 25 years of experience assisting clients reach their goals and move forward. Tune in each week for a dynamic conversation with experts, Colorado adventurers, and residents that explores the ins, outs, and specific nuances of buying the perfect mountain home or selling your dream home in Evergreen, Conifer, Bailey, and surrounding areas to catch a glimpse into the Colorado lifestyle that's a part of you.
Welcome to the podcast. Today, our guest is Scott Murdoch. Scott is a district wildlife officer, Colorado Parks and Wildlife. How are you today, Scott?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing well. Thanks for joining us today. Tell me about your background and how you became a wildlife officer, and what does a wildlife officer do, and what are your responsibilities?
So that's a good question. So I grew up kind of in the suburbs of Denver. I've always been an avid outdoorsman. We got involved in outdoors hunting and fishing and camping and boating, things like that growing up. And I always knew that I wanted to do something in that regard for my career. I just didn't envision myself being stuck inside all the time. And so I ended up following one of my passions, which was fisheries. And I went to school for fisheries biology up at CSU. I graduated there with a bachelor's in fisheries, and then actually found this job. And the rest is history, I guess. I worked a number of different places around the state. Most notably, I worked up in Grand Lake for about 4 years, and I transferred down into the Conifer area, and I've been here for 8 or 9. And I've worked for the state as a wildlife officer for nearly 15 years.
That's great. It sounds like a good fit with your passion for the outdoors,
Sure.
for sure. Kind of an overall question. How common is it to run into wildlife when you live in the foothills? We live in Conifer, and of course, we run into wildlife a lot. And I'm sure you see a lot of different iterations of wildlife. And so, living up here on a daily basis, how common is it?
The foothills are kind of a unique thing, right? You get down into the city and the suburbs, and wildlife spottings can be spotty at best. That's former habitat that we've developed and largely pushed the wildlife out of. And we kind of have this, the wildland urban interface is kind of what we call this foothills zone, where there's larger properties than, say, suburbs, but they're certainly not large ranches or kind of open lands like you would see in further or more remote parts of western or far eastern parts of Colorado. And so you get kind of this intermix, right? The animals in some ways develop some sort of tolerance to people and their presence. And we can talk a little bit about why that is later. But, we have kind of this abundance of wildlife, and then you have this development that's in and amongst naturally good wildlife habitat. And so wildlife interactions, whether it be good or bad, become quite frequent. And so we deal with a lot of that as wildlife officers. We deal with, the law enforcement aspect of things, folks that are not doing what they're supposed to regarding wildlife. We deal with nuisance issues. So people that are having challenges with wildlife, things like bears getting into dumpsters, conflicts with vehicle strikes, things like feeding wildlife. Those are all pretty important topics that we deal with on a regular basis. We do a lot of education when it comes to these kind of this wildland urban interface, because you get a lot of folks that have knowledge of wildlife. They wanted to live up in the woods or kind of in a little bit more remote area, but it certainly isn't the same as if you're going to live in a much more rural part of Colorado. And so we do a lot of education in regards to that as well. But it's quite common. We deal with lots and lots of conflicts. And it's one of our more challenging parts of our job, is that the development actually hinders our ability to manage wildlife in a lot of ways. Whereas a subdivision naturally doesn't have as much wildlife. And so some of those limitations aren't necessarily there.
How does that come into play, Scott? You mentioned tolerance with wildlife. Lay that out, and how does that work overall with folks living up here, with whether they have a smaller parcel of land or a larger parcel of land?
Yeah, so wildlife's naturally going to be more reclusive. They don't really want to be around people. However, when we kind of build in their habitat, build in these really good habitats, the wildlife is naturally going to be in and around these homes and subdivisions. And ultimately, folks, unfortunately, take kind of matters into their own hands and think that they need to feed these animals. And so feeding animals is probably the biggest source of habituation. Feeding here in Colorado for big game is illegal. It's one of those things that has a variety of negative consequences, such as migration, disruption, disease transmission, but probably most notably is that habituation. So these animals go into areas, now they start seeing people as a source of food. And so animals like deer and elk start seeing people as sources of food. And then predators such as bears and lions also come in to feed on those types of animals and kind of compound our issues with those prey species being in and around subdivisions.
So it changes, in essence, the way they would naturally habitate or live, or that sort of thing. By feeding them, it changes their instincts, or maybe not their instincts, but the way they live, so to speak.
Yeah, they stop utilizing the habitat the way they would normally. Deer and elk are migratory animals, and so they're going to move from areas of high abundance of food, and then when conditions change and now food abundance lowers, they're going to move to new areas. And so the process of migration, from high elevation summer habitats to low elevation winter habitats, that's a normal migration pattern. And when we set up these feed stations that people all have, or we start, planting all of our ornamental shrubs and, gardens and different landscaping that is more attractive than some of the more natural native forage, that will actually create kind of an artificial abundance of food in a particular area. And so those animals may or may not leave habitats that they normally would have moved through. And so they can overutilize the existing habitat that's there, or if they're using all of them or using the same habitats, high densities of animals in one particular area is going to increase that disease transmission. Plus they lose their knowledge of these known migration corridors. And when they lose those known migration corridors, those things are hard to rebuild. And so, if there is a very severe winter, they've just lost a lot of their kind of flexibility in adapting to that environment. And so we end up with kind of a whole bunch of different factors. So, it's not just the disease, it's not just the attraction of predators that feeding causes, but all kinds of different issues.
Do their migration patterns change, Scott? We live in Conifer off of Richmond Hill Road. I notice we don't have a lot of elk. I've seen more this year than I have in past years. We certainly have a lot of deer, and it seems to be more elk in the Evergreen area or Southern Evergreen. Is that something that changes, or is that kind of what you're mentioning, that those things change, and would they come back, or how does that work?
They certainly can. The stuff south of 285 kind of has a different dynamic as far as elk than the stuff north of 285. Far less elk south of 285. There's a variety of reasons. A big part of that, is as we develop, we block a lot of our migration corridors. And so, when the Safeway was built there in Conifer, that disrupted one of their main migration corridors through there. For elk, and so that's I think one of the factors. There's not probably only one. We're actually seeing more of our elk utilizing eastern portions of Jefferson County down towards Lockheed Martin, Kester Road, even down towards Chatfield. And so a lot of those elk that used to hang out up on Richmond Hill 10 or 15 years ago have now migrated further west and found refuge over there. One of the main reasons was that blizzard of 2003 caused a lot of those animals to move lower elevations, and a lot of them didn't come back. They found new and novel habitats that were really underutilized by a lot of other animals. But we do still see that migration. We see a lot of bulls that will move from those low elevation areas in the summer, and they'll move all the way up towards evergreen during the rut. We've got a lot of data to suggest that as well. But yeah, I would say 285 is a pretty tremendous barrier for a lot of the animals. And I would say food limitations in a lot of that southern portion of kind of the conifer evergreen area. The food and forage is not probably as sufficient as some of the higher or more northern areas in the county.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. That's very interesting. I see, Scott, that you wear a lot of different hats. I saw a couple of videos online of one where you helped remove a swing from antlers of an elk, I believe, and then also a tire in the last few years. So you do an awful lot. So let's say someone's out hiking or just on their property and they do encounter a bear. What's the proper procedure when you have that type of experience?
Sure. So the biggest thing with bears is you want to make sure that that bear knows that you're around, right? So most of the incidences where we have a negative kind of interaction with the bear is when the bear is startled. So maybe you come around a corner and you startle that bear. Sometimes that bear will kind of bluff charge you. Our bears here in Colorado are all black bears. We don't have any brown bears or grizzlies. We may have bears that are brown in color, but they're still black bears. And the black bear biology is significantly different than a grizzly or brown bear biology. And so, what I'm talking about today is solely focused on black bears. But anytime you startle an animal, that animal may react, not necessarily in an offensive or an aggressive way. It just is kind of defensive and trying to I got to kind of regain control of this situation. So maybe you're in between a sow and a cub, or maybe you startle it and you're on the path of the escape route. Those are the situations that you want to, just talk in kind of a low, calm voice. You want to look towards that animal, but just kind of slowly back away. Generally with animals, you want to, appear larger, right? You're not going to see, or they're not going to perceive you as something that is prey, especially with a mountain lion. You don't want to act small. But if you just back up slowly, talk to it, and generally just leave or make sure that that animal's got an escape route, you should generally be fine in that situation. We have very, very few incidences with black bears. In my career, I've only dealt with a couple situations where somebody's been injured. And most of those situations are things where there's habitual feeding, whether intentional or unintentional through garbage, where a bear's getting into an area constantly, and then the bear gets pinned into an area. So maybe the bear's in an enclosed dumpster area and you're the only way out. It may run over you. It's not like the bear's really trying to attack you per se, but it wants to escape that area. And so it's going to swat you out of the way so it can get out. Same thing if a bear is in a home. So those are the situations that, as long as that bear feels like it's got an escape route, it's probably not going to attack. It may bluff charge, but it's probably not going to attack or hit you.
You mentioned a bit mountain lions. I'm sure the protocol is a little different, but let's touch on that briefly as well.
Sure. So there's kind of two main interactions that we see here in Colorado. The first being more common than the latter. The first is generally a mountain lion that's defending a kill. So we get all these deer that happen to be in and around subdivisions. Inevitably, one of them is going to get killed by a lion. And that lion may drag that carcass up under your deck or underneath your trampoline, or stash it up underneath some bushes in and around your home. And so when somebody comes home, they see this lion kind of lurking around their property, or maybe it's tucked up underneath of a tree. Generally, the kill will be buried, so it's hard to tell that there's actually a kill there. But that animal will be up on top of that kill, and it's not really going to want to leave. And so they're like, well, this animal's stalking me. It's super visible. This animal won't flee when I yell at it. And that's very common behavior with mountain lions. Very seldom is there a negative interaction with a person in terms of somebody being attacked in that regard. But those animals, obviously, they spend a lot of energy trying to kill that animal. And so they're going to defend it. Usually if you get close to that, they will flee at some point. but they will let you approach pretty closely. And I've been fairly close to a number of different lions, and I've yet to have a negative situation where I felt in fear. So those are situations where I wouldn't particularly feel super scared. But those are situations too that landowners can call us and we can try and help resolve the situation, right? We don't want a lion with the cache under somebody's deck. But if it's on a more remote part of your property and you can tolerate a lion feeding on your property for a couple of days, it's better to have a fed lion, right, than a hungry lion. Usually in a situation where we've got a kill like that, we'll come in and we'll take that kill out of there. That lion will kind of move off and kind of reset its hunting pattern. But
we had that specific situation, Scott, about 2 years ago when it was really cold that February. We had some really cold temperatures. We had a deer that must have got hit by a car, but it couldn't move his rear end, and it died on the property, and it got pulled down by a mountain lion under some rocks and trees. And it fed down there for, I don't know, 2 or 3 days, I would say. And then I went down there and pulled the carcass off. Nothing left. There were some hooves and, the skull and a few ribs. Ate most of the ribs, but that was very, very efficient. But anyway,
without a doubt,
we kind of steered clear of there. Our dog was very interested in going down there, so we put him on a leash for a few days. But anyway, so yeah, that's part of living up here. And what happens, Scott, if with little ones? I know that mountain lions, the prey might look a little bit more enticing with a younger person, maybe not, but more so than someone that's bigger. What recommendations for, if you're hiking with children, that sort of thing, or just living out here and your smaller animals too?
Sure. So that kind of leads me back to that second point. When we do have negative interactions, more infrequently, it's a mountain lion that's acting in aggressive manner, right? So it's offensive, it's predatory, right? Mountain lions are obligate carnivores, which means they attack you, they're trying to kill you, right? They're trying to eat you. And so, any mountain lion is going to do this kind of cost-benefit analysis in its head, it's going to weigh the risks of attacking whatever it plans on attack versus the reward. A very hungry animal may take more risks. A sick animal, an old animal, a very young animal may take additional risks depending on the situation. So most commonly, when we do have some sort of negative interaction, an attack or something like that, which is exceedingly uncommon, you're far more likely to be hurt or injured by something else. But the biggest thing is right, you want to look big, you want to look fearful, you want to at least acknowledge that mountain lion is there, because surprise is its biggest kind of advantage that it has. And so if it knows the element of surprise is gone, it's far less likely to attack. And so looking at it, raising your hands, throwing objects at it, shouting at it, those are all positive things. And then of course you're going to want to back out of that particular area. That could also be a situation where that lion's just on a kill and you just happen to be close. You take that as an aggressive thing rather than it being kind of defensive. So you want to back out of there slowly, create a lot of noise. Anytime you're recreating in lion country, that animal is going to see smaller prey items as being easier to catch. They're going to be more valuable. Mountain lions generally will hunt early morning, late evening. And so it's probably not a good idea if you've got a big shrubby yard to allow your very young kids to be wandering around the yard alone at those low light hours, right? It's still exceedingly rare. It's not a common thing, but the consequences can be pretty severe. I kind of equate the same thing with pets and livestock, right? You're not going to leave your kid out in those low light conditions by himself. So don't leave your dog or your livestock unprotected in the same way. So those are kind of the basic things. And clearing out the shrub or the grass in and around your property, opening those sight lines, that'll help eliminate that surprise factor with those lions. And then, just being loud and being in groups is a good way to reduce any conflict.
Yeah, that's great insight. It kind of goes hand in hand with fire mitigation on a property too. Not
Yep.
only does it help, it kind of helps twofold there. What about moose, Scott? I know that we seem to see a few more of those in the area. Any run-ins with those, or I've heard that they can be a little bit more aggressive than other large game.
Yeah, so out of the kind of the big three, bears, mountain lions, and moose, moose are the ones I'd be most fearful of. In my career, I've dealt with a significant number of serious moose injuries to people, broken bones, comas, you know, one fatality. So it's not a good situation, right? A moose, maybe 1,000 pounds, it comes over you, even if it's not really trying to, it can inflict some pretty serious injuries. Most of the incidences I've run into have been because of dogs, whether off leash or on leash, most of which have been off leash. They view, excuse me, sorry.
No
They
worries.
view, canines as their natural predator, right? Wolves and moose go hand in hand. And so when they see a four-legged canine, they just assume that it's a predator. And unlike deer and elk, moose will often fight back and they'll kind of stand their ground. And generally your off-leash dog finds a moose, moose charges dog runs back to you, dog can run faster than you, and you are the one that ends up getting pummeled. And it's an unfortunate situation and one that's super easy to prevent. And frankly, I would assume basically in any of these habitats in and around conifer and evergreen at this point, you can see moose. I've seen them in Pleasant Park and by Conifer High School and Evergreen Lake and Schaefer's Crossing, Staunton State Park, and a number of other places.
Yeah,
So
for sure. And I've seen Staunton and then some neighbors of ours off in North Turkey. We saw one there in a pond recently. So more so, we've been here over 25 years, but more so in the last few years, we've seen them than we did in the past. So overall, Scott, how can people effectively share the land with the animals in the foothills?
So the biggest thing, is just know what to do at certain times of the year. Different times of the year, you may have different responses with wildlife. Early in the springtime, so usually around late May, early June, that's usually when our animals start giving birth. And so we're going to start seeing an influx of calves and calves, or cows and calves, and does and fawns having birth. And so you're going to see these animals in and around your communities. Things like keeping your dogs on leash and secured will help keep those animals from getting chased and run. I deal with a lot of fawns and calves that get killed every year by dogs. The other thing is we get elk and deer that get aggressive, trying to defend their young at that time of the year. So making sure that you are aware of your surroundings and can basically give those animals the space that they deserve. Bears usually will start coming out of hibernation, usually about tax day. So we always, as a good rule of thumb, say from tax day to Thanksgiving, pull all your bird feeders in, make sure that trash is secured. All of your attractants have to go in. Don't let the bear tell you when to put them in. Tax day to Thanksgiving.
Does that include hummingbird feeders, Scott?
In my opinion, yes. I don't see any need to be feeding wildlife of any kind. There's more than enough resources out there, and our wildlife has survived for lots and lots of years without us. And so while it's neat and cute to see animals, the consequence of having a bear that starts hanging around your property and eventually breaking into cars and homes, it's not worth the consequence, or I guess the benefit of feeding a hummingbird. That's my personal take, and I guess you guys can do what you want. But ultimately, it's one of those where, we got to live with these wildlife. And so just because, one person's doing the right thing doesn't mean that bear conflict's going to be avoided, right? All of us in the community have to step up because, we're dealing with more and more people and conflicts. And ultimately that means more habituated bears breaking into cars, bears breaking into houses. And once they start breaking into houses, that's dangerous. And we end up having to kill bears, which is the worst part of my job.
Yeah, I'm sure you never want to take a life, if it's not warranted,
No.
in any situation.
Yep, especially when things are easily preventable, removing attractants. Those bears have to get food, so they're going to go somewhere else. If there's not attractants at your house, they're going to go somewhere else. It's just, it's as simple as that. As the season progresses, one of the things that we're starting to see now is the elk rut is starting to pick up in and around Evergreen in particular. And so, this next month and a half, folks are going to have to be real diligent about trying to avoid, some of these large bulls, because they start getting pretty aggressive at this time of year.
Yeah, good insight for sure. So, Scott, just a couple more questions. What's one of your craziest stories you could share? Something that you've experienced or encountered?
Sure. I guess just yesterday or 2 days ago, I tranquilized another animal. This one was an elk that had stuck its head through kind of a wire cage that must have been around some garden plant or little sapling or something. And it stuck its head through there. And then when it lifted its head off, this little wire tube was around its head. And then, of course, it's trying to feed and drink. It bends down, crushes the end of this tube. So now it looks like this elk's literally got like a hardware cloth mask all the way around its head. So it can't drink, it can't eat. It's still running around the herd. Unfortunately, we had a few folks that called it in. I was able to tranquilize that and take that off. But, it never ceases to amaze me what these animals end up tangling themselves up with in and around the community. I mean, I've seen swing sets and basketball hoops and tomato cages and trash cans and hammocks and, volleyball nets and, Christmas lights and barbed wire and erosion fence. The list goes on and on, and it's a constant thing that we end up dealing with around town, which is kind of fun because you get to see the animals and handle them up close. But, if we weren't able to tranquilize those animals, many of them would be dead. So.
Well, it's great that you can, because it's, as you said, it's kind of being simpatico with wildlife. We live amongst, we live in their atmosphere. So, it's trying to live in harmony, so to speak. What is your favorite thing, Scott, about being a wildlife officer?
So I'd say the most exciting part of my job is I never know where the day is going to take me. Each day, each week is different than the last, and each time of the year is different. So, we're starting to go into fall, into the hunting seasons. And so we're going to be starting to do a lot more intensive law enforcement patrols. We deal with a lot of pretty high profile investigations. We've had some very large and complex and egregious cases here in Evergreen and Conifer. And so doing those types of investigations is a lot of fun. And then, you may be doing something like that and then get called out to tranquilize an animal. And then the next thing you know, you are dealing with a roadkill. And then later on, you're dealing with a landowner who wants to work on a timber project. And so you're working on how do you improve your wildlife habitat or the timber to help benefit wildlife. And maybe the next week you're doing a hunter education class or doing a podcast like this that will teach folks about wildlife and how to live with them. And so literally each day is different. I never get bored of what I do because, I get to see beautiful places and I get to meet fun people and I get to protect wildlife.
Yeah, that sounds great. Lots of variety, and gosh, you get to do it, like you said, being outside and within, our beautiful Colorado. So you've shared a lot of really good information, Scott. Where can people go to learn more about you and wildlife safety in Colorado?
Sure. So the Colorado Parks and Wildlife website, that's probably one of our best locations for good resources. We've got a Living with Wildlife page on there. Things like wildlife friendly fencing, interactions with deer and elk and bear and moose and fox and coyote. And mountain lion and all those types of animals are covered on our website. Folks in and around Conifer and Evergreen may also be interested in hunting. We use hunting as a management tool, and we are the agency that is responsible for managing the population. And so all of that can be found on our website as well. as well. If you type in Colorado Parks and Wildlife in Google, it'll pull up your website. It's cpw.state.co.us is what it is, but it's probably easier to just Google it. And, we've got a lot of good resources. You can also reach out to any of our wildlife offices. And if you have a location specific question, the wildlife officers are more than willing to talk to you as well.
Well, that's great. Is there anything you'd like to add that we didn't touch on?
I think that's about it. Yeah.
Well, good luck with your day. And I really appreciate your time, Scott. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thanks, Robert.
To the Foothills, a Colorado lifestyle and real estate podcast. On the podcast, I interview real estate experts, Colorado adventurers, and residents who enjoy the serenity and lifestyle of living in our mountain communities. Tune in each week for a conversation that explores the ins and outs of buying the perfect mountain home or selling your dream home, and catch a glimpse into the Colorado lifestyle that's a part of you.